I thought it would be just another Sunday project. A tilting garden wall, a loose brick cap, and a stubborn gate that scraped the ground every time I opened it. I didn't expect a handful of quiet words, gentle as morning light, to crack me wide open. Last night's windstorm wasn't the only thing that had been leaning. Turns out I'd been tilting under the weight of everything too, more than I cared to acknowledge. When my granddaughter arrived with her toolbox and that confident presence that reminded me so much of her grandmother, I figured we'd patch mortar and call it done. Instead, one simple phrase from her dropped straight through my defenses and opened something I'd kept sealed for too long. I know it sounds overdramatic for a garden wall, but if you've ever carried your whole world on your shoulders with nothing but will and stubbornness, you'll understand why this ordinary afternoon shook me the way it did. Stay with me, because the moment that undid me wasn't a crack in the stone. It was a crack in the armor I'd been wearing, and you'll want to hear what slipped through. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. I love knowing you're out there, from mountain towns to seaside villages, big cities to quiet corners. It makes this little garden feel like a place we all share. By late morning, the rain had cleared, leaving everything washed clean and shimmering. The garden wall along the east side leaned outward like someone bending to catch their breath. Clay mud clung to the base in thick collars. The air carried the scent of wet stone and lavender, and somewhere down the lane, a hedge trimmer buzzed its familiar weekend song. My flower beds still held yesterday's rain, roses, mint, a stubborn patch of wildflowers that refused to surrender to the seasons. I'd already set out a pitcher of lemonade on the garden table and arranged my tools the way my wife used to. Measuring tape, masonry trowel, spirit-level rubber mallet, bag of mortar mix, 2 replacement capstones, and a bucket for water. I say my wife used to, but these days it's just me. That's my way. I'm the kind of person who needs to understand the weight of something before deciding whether to pick it up. When the wall shifted during last night's storm, and I heard that hollow grinding of stone giving way, I lay there in the dark, calculating what the repair would demand. Materials, effort, time, the small defeat of admitting I needed help. I could have called a mason. Instead, in a moment that was equal parts pride and wisdom, I still can't tell which, I texted my granddaughter, Sophie. If you're a grandmother out there listening, you know that peculiar feeling when a young woman you watched learn to walk shows up at your door fully grown, capable, steady. It's pride mixed with a touch of wonder. She arrived just past 10 in a silver hatchback, windows down, soft music playing. She stepped out wearing work jeans and a faded green tank top, her dark hair pulled back in a practical braid. She waved, then reached into the back seat for a canvas tool bag that looked deceptively light. She crossed the path with easy confidence, already studying the wall the way a good mechanic sizes up an engine. No judgment, just assessment. "Morning, Grandpa," she said, kissing my cheek. The word still catches me off guard. Grandpa. So casual, so tender. Like a nickname that broke through all the formality we used when life got complicated. "You didn't need to drop everything," I said, partly meaning it, partly hoping she would anyway. "I know you've got your own weekend." "This is my weekend," she replied with a smile. "Besides, you promised those lemon bars." I laughed and gestured to the covered plate on the table. Don't let promises of sweets distract you from the fact that we've got a wall that's forgotten its purpose. She squinted at the worst section, where mortar had crumbled away and left gaps between the stones. "Weather got the better of it," she said. "Happens to all of us eventually." That's the kind of comment I'd normally brush past. I kept myself busy unrolling the measuring tape, checking the lean against plumb. She watched without interfering, which I appreciated. Respect feels like giving someone room to move. "Let me mix the mortar," she said when I reached for the bag. "That stuff's heavy when it's wet." "I know how to mix mortar," I said, sharper than I intended. "Been doing it since before you were born." She held up her hands. "Together, then. I'll do the bulk mixing. You add water and check consistency. Sound fair?" "Fair," I agreed, because the truth of it settled something in me. She wasn't taking over. She was sharing the load. We worked in comfortable rhythm. She poured the dry mix into the wheelbarrow, creating a crater in the center. I added water gradually while she folded it with the hoe, checking the texture, adding more powder when it got too loose. Every motion filled with that earthy, mineral smell that always reminds me of building things, of new beginnings. Sweat gathered at my temples despite the breeze. I wiped it with my forearm, leaving a streak of gray dust like a warrior's mark. That stone's salvageable, I said, pointing to a cracked cap piece. If we reset it with fresh mortar and add support underneath, we'll get another decade. She picked up the spirit level and held it against the wall's face. The bubble drifted and settled. You like things perfectly straight, she observed. I like things reliable, I corrected. Straight is reliable. She nodded and adjusted the string line we'd set up as a guide, snapping it to hear that crisp sound. That tone took me back. The summer your grandmother and I built this wall with rented equipment that hummed one steady note all day long. Half an hour passed. We cleared out old mortar, brushed away debris, checked measurements. Sophie lifted a heavy stone. I steadied it. We eased it into place, wiggling it until it sat just right. She took the level and tested multiple angles while I watched that bubble like it held all the answers. Wait, she said softly. It wants to tip forward. Right there, hold. The word hold. Simple, ordinary, but it carried something heavier. I pressed. She adjusted. We froze. Satisfied, she nodded. We applied fresh mortar, smoothing it into the joints with the trowel, shaping the surface to shed water. Then we rechecked with the level. The bubble hovered perfectly, as if the universe had finally exhaled. From across the garden, my neighbor Mrs. Chen appeared, pruning shears in hand, her wide sun hat bright as a yellow flag. She's the type who believes gardens make moral statements, and too many weeds in September means you've lost your discipline. Morning, she called. That wall going to hold this time? If you can resist leaning your bicycle against it when you visit, I said, softening the jab with a smile. Sophie didn't roll her eyes or tense up. She stood relaxed, one hand resting on the wall, and said, We're reinforcing the foundation. Should last year's. Good, Mrs. Chen said, inspecting as if she were a city official. My garden hose keeps snagging on the tilt. Looks messy. We'll get it squared away, Sophie assured her. Nothing will snag, Mrs. Chen wandered off, satisfied. I caught Sophie's glance and shook my head. She's been my neighbor for 20 years, I muttered. Still thinks I need supervision. You taught me that some people measure their worth by giving advice, Sophie said. If it makes her feel useful, why fight it? It's a strange sensation when the young echo wisdom you thought you were still learning yourself. Pride mixed with a kind of melancholy I can't quite name. The gentle shift from being the teacher to watching them become teachers themselves. We broke for lemonade. The ice clinked against the glass, and that first sip was cool relief. Sophie sat on the bench beside me, forearms on her knees, watching a blackbird hop across the grass with something in its beak. I traced the water ring under my glass, a perfect circle that would fade by afternoon. You doing okay? She asked, not looking at me, which somehow made it easier to answer honestly. I'm fine, I said automatically, then corrected myself. I'm learning to ask for help without feeling like I'm surrendering. She smiled into her glass. Dad says you'd rather balance on a ladder in the rain than call someone. Your father enjoys exaggeration, I said, then admitted. But he's not entirely wrong. She didn't tease. She took a breath and waited, the way you wait at an intersection and gesture for the other person to go first. That waiting became the invitation I needed. Your grandmother used to say the wall was less about keeping things out than about marking what mattered, I said. A boundary makes you decide who you are within it. When she passed, I felt like all the boundaries disappeared, and I've been holding invisible lines ever since. Sophie turned to look at me properly. Her eyes, same steady gray as her grandmother's, held mine without rushing. I think you've been the foundation, she said, tapping the wall with her knuckle. Taking every storm, every pressure, so the rest of us didn't crumble. I laughed softly to keep emotion from taking over. Foundations crack if they're the only thing holding weight. That's why we repair them, she said. Together. We returned to work. The mortar would set enough to hold if we didn't test it too soon. So we turned to the gate. She fetched the angle grinder to smooth the bottom edge and asked the question I appreciate most. You want to mark the cut line? Please, I said, and drew a chalk line where metal met rust. She sat up, checked her safety glasses, and looked to me again. Ready? That's your territory, I said. I'll steady the gate. She made the cut carefully, letting the tool do the work. The high whine sent birds scattering from the apple tree. We fitted the gate back onto its hinges, tested the swing, made micro adjustments until it moved smoothly. We both stepped back and grinned. There's particular satisfaction in restoring something rather than replacing it. Grandpa, she said, quieter now, and I looked up because I heard the shift in her voice. She was wiping dust from her hands with a rag, a nervous gesture she doesn't realize she makes. Can I say something without you turning it into another project? Depends on whether you're about to assign me homework, I said, trying to keep it light, though something in my chest braced itself. She picked up the spirit level and balanced it in her palms like something precious. You've spent my whole life showing me how to show up, she said. For commitments, for work, for people, I'm good at it because you were uncompromising about it. But somewhere along the line, I think you decided your job was to be the person who never needed anything. And I didn't realize until now how much I've been waiting for permission to show up for you. It wasn't dramatic. No swelling music, no grand gesture. It landed like truth does, quiet and absolute. The garden shrank to just the space between her words and my heart. The bird, the distant traffic, the rustle of leaves, everything else faded like sound muffled by fog. I opened my mouth, but whatever words I had were old and brittle and wouldn't bend. My vision blurred the wall into watercolor. I set my hands on the rough stone and felt the texture under my palms, the cool surface where mortar met rock. I felt 70 and 17 at once. Both the boy who learned to mix cement and the man who learned to do everything alone. She stepped closer, not crowding, just near enough that if I leaned, I'd find her solid. We can keep this level together, she said, adjusting the tool so the bubble drifted and returned to center. You don't have to hold it alone anymore. That did it. The words were so gentle they had nowhere to go but straight through. Tears came fast and without apology, years of weather breaking loose all at once. I pressed my palm to my eyes as if that could stop it, but it didn't, and that was all right. When you've earned a moment of release, you don't ask permission. She didn't try to fix it or tell me it was okay. She knows me well enough to let me choose my own dignity. She just stood with me the way you stand at a memorial or a milestone, a witness, not a rescuer. I hate needing help, I said finally, when I could speak again. She nodded. I know, but you taught me that needing isn't weakness. It's honesty. It tells the people who love you where they can step in. I laughed a little at that, messy as it was. When did you get so wise? When you stopped lecturing and started showing, she said, softening the words with a smile so I knew it was affection, not criticism. We stood like that until the emotion eased and the world settled around us again. I could smell the sweetness of cut grass, warm and golden. The mortar at the base had begun to set. A butterfly drifted past, bright as a dancing flame. Sophie set the level back on the wall and gave it a gentle tap, watching the bubble roll and return like a marble finding home. All right, I said, clearing my throat back into order. Let's finish that cap before Mrs. Chen comes back with a clipboard. Yes, sir, she said, but there was nothing obedient in it. It was camaraderie. We worked in the easy silence people use after the real work is done. She held the capstone while I packed mortar underneath. I smoothed the joints, feeling the tool push back into my hand with each stroke. When we set the final stone in place and tested it with pressure, it held firm and true, settling with a satisfying solidity you can feel in your bones. I don't know why. But that feeling has always been like a small blessing. Stone telling mortar, I trust you. Sophie stepped back to admire it the way craftspeople do when something turns out right. A nod. A quiet, yeah. I poured the last of the lemonade and handed her the glass. She drank, eyes on the wall, then shifted her gaze to me, not checking if I was still fragile, but sharing the satisfaction. You know, she said, Grandma used to say you were the strongest person she knew. She said that because I never argued with her about paint colors, I answered, and we both smiled at the old joke. She also said your strength wasn't the hard kind. It was the kind that bends so it doesn't break. I let that settle. The garden felt more spacious than when we'd started, as if straightening one line had squared everything else. Inside the house, the old clock chimed 1. The afternoon had stretched long and generous, the way good days do when you give them purpose and they return the favor. The tools clinked softly as we gathered them, that particular quiet that follows honest work. The wall stood straighter than it had in years, stones secure, gates swinging with clean purpose. I should have felt finished, but instead there was something still tugging at me, like the day itself had one more thing to say. Sophie stretched, brushing dust from her arms, and glanced toward the house. The pitcher sat empty now, just ice melting slowly. a soft rhythm that matched my own thoughts. We carried the tools in together, stacking them neatly in the shed. Such a small thing, sharing the weight of the toolbox, one hand on each handle. But I noticed how natural it felt. No negotiation about who carried what. No performance of strength, just easy balance. For so many years, I believed balance meant carrying both ends myself. Inside, I opened the drawer by the telephone and pulled out a thin envelope I'd been avoiding for weeks. It had been buried beneath bills and receipts, a letter from the lawyer who'd handled your grandmother's estate. I hadn't wanted to face it alone. Seeing Sophie out there, level in hand, certainty in her voice made me realize I didn't have to be alone anymore. Sophie noticed my hesitation. "What's that?" "Paperwork," I said, which was true but felt like hiding. "Want company while you read it?" she asked. Not pushing, not assuming, just offering. I nodded, throat tight. "If you don't mind." We sat at the kitchen table, its surface scarred with decades of meals and conversations, birthday cakes and difficult discussions. I slid my finger under the seal, pulled the paper free, and read slowly. It wasn't complicated. Just the final notice about a small estate settlement. Enough money to cover the repairs I'd been postponing, maybe update the plumbing. Practical blessings, nothing more. But the words at the bottom caught me. In recognition of a life built together, may this provide some measure of comfort. Typed, impersonal, yet somehow it felt like a whisper. I set the letter down, and for the second time that day, tears came. Sophie reached across the table, not for the paper, but for my hand. Her grip was steady, not crushing, not saving, just present. "Grandpa," she said, "you don't have to read things like this alone anymore." I turned my palm so our hands fit properly, skin against skin. The warmth reminded me of when she was small, running through the same kitchen with scraped elbows, reaching for comfort. Only now she was the one offering it. "I've been afraid to lean," I admitted. "Afraid if I did, no one would be there to catch me." She squeezed gently. "I'm here. I'll always be here." The clock on the wall ticked into the silence, but it didn't feel empty. It felt full, of presence, of history, of the kind of love that doesn't shout but simply stands steady. Later, as the sun dropped lower, we walked back to the garden. The wall cast a long shadow across the path, straight and strong, reaching toward the flower beds. I stood there for a long moment, watching how the new stones caught the late light, how the line of the wall held true. "You know," I said, half to myself, half to her, "I thought fixing this wall was just about stone and mortar." Sophie glanced at me, waiting. "But it was about something else," I continued. "About remembering I don't have to stand alone." She smiled, the same smile her grandmother used to wear when something in life finally made sense. "That's the strongest foundation of all," she said. "We didn't need to add anything after that." The garden was peaceful, the air gentle, the wall standing firm. I knew then that sometimes the truest repairs aren't the ones you can measure, but the ones that settle quietly in the heart, where strength and love meet without fanfare. As we stood side by side, watching the last daylight paint the garden gold, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Steady and deep, like the earth itself holding me up. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, whether you're in your living room or out on your own porch as evening comes, I hope something here resonated with you. Life has a way of reminding us that even when we think we need to stand tall all on our own, sometimes the strongest thing we can do is let the people who love us help carry the weight. At my age, and maybe at yours too, I've learned that walls, families, and hearts all need tending. And when we let others help with the repairs, we find not weakness, but a deeper kind of strength, the kind that lasts. So wherever you are tonight, remember this. You don't have to hold everything alone. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply lean and trust that someone will be there to steady you. The wall stands. The garden grows. And we carry on together,